The fork felt unnaturally heavy in my hand. Across the polished oak table, my mother beamed, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she gestured with her own utensil towards the untouched plates. "Isn't this just lovely?" she purred, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that always preceded a carefully orchestrated disappointment. My brother, Mark, nodded enthusiastically, his gaze fixed on the woman beside him, Sarah, who was already reaching for a second helping of the roast. That was my first clue, the tiny tremor of unease that ran through me. She'd only just finished her first plate. The air in my childhood home, usually thick with the scent of pine and cinnamon this time of year, now felt strangely stale, charged with an unspoken tension. It was Christmas Day, a day that had always been less about festive cheer and more about navigating the treacherous currents of my mother's peculiar brand of domestic tyranny. For years, I'd perfected the art of appeasement, of shrinking myself to avoid the inevitable tidal wave of criticism. My brother, bless his easygoing nature, had always been her golden boy, the one who could do no wrong, while I was the perpetual disappointment, the one who always needed to try harder. Sarah, new to our family's peculiar rituals, was blissfully unaware, her cheeks flushed with the warmth of what she probably perceived as a loving family gathering. The buffet spread was modest, a stark contrast to the opulent meals I'd seen on social media. A perfectly roasted chicken, a few sides, potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce. Nothing extravagant, but perfectly sufficient. Or it would have been, if my mother's appetite for control wasn't insatiable. She'd spent weeks planning this meal, scrutinizing every ingredient, every recipe, and, of course, assigning blame for any perceived imperfection. The week leading up to Christmas had been a masterclass in passive aggression. A stray comment about the price of butter, a sigh that seemed to imply I was somehow responsible for the rising cost of groceries, a pointed question about my career trajectory that landed like a lead balloon. She'd even managed to make the Christmas Eve gift exchange an exercise in subtle humiliation, pressing a flimsy, generic scarf into my hands while presenting Mark with a brand-new, top-of-the-line espresso machine. I remembered a particularly vivid Christmas, maybe 5 years ago. I'd spent hours meticulously crafting a handmade gift for my mother, a hand-knitted throw blanket, a labor of love that had taken me through countless late nights. When I'd presented it, her reaction had been less than enthusiastic. She'd run a manicured finger over the stitches, a faint frown on her face. "It's cozy," she'd said, her tone suggesting it was more suited for a charity shop than her living room. Later that week, I'd seen it tucked away in the guest bedroom and used, while a perfectly good store-bought cashmere throw lay draped over her favorite armchair. It was a small thing, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it was a pattern. Her appreciation was conditional, her approval always just out of reach. Then there was the incident with the inheritance. After my father's passing, the division of assets had been contentious. My mother, ever the pragmatist, had insisted on a strict valuation of everything, down to the last dusty knick-knack. I'd found her one afternoon, sitting in the dimly lit study, a stack of bank statements spread before her, meticulously cross-referencing numbers with a fierce intensity that bordered on obsession. She hadn't even acknowledged my presence at first, lost in her calculations. When she finally looked up, her eyes were cold and calculating. "This has to be fair, dear," she'd said, her voice devoid of any warmth, utterly, undeniably fair. But her definition of fair often seemed to tilt in her favor, and any protest, however mild, was met with a dismissive wave of her hand and a pronouncement of my own perceived immaturity. So, the scene at the Christmas table was, sadly, not entirely out of character. The unease in my gut, however, was amplified by the sheer audacity of it all. We'd barely started eating, and Sarah, who had been nothing but polite and gracious since she arrived, was already on her second helping of chicken. My mother watched her, a faint smile playing on her lips. I kept my gaze fixed on my own plate, picking at the skin of the chicken, trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in my stomach. I hadn't had a proper meal all day. My mother had been in a flurry of activity, but every time I'd offered to help with the food, she'd waved me away. "No, dear, you just relax. I've got it all under control." It was code, of course. It meant, don't interfere, and don't expect to be a priority. The silence stretched, broken only by the clinking of cutlery and Sarah's murmured appreciation. "This chicken is absolutely divine, Aunt Carol," she said, her voice genuinely impressed. My mother preened. "Oh, it's just a simple roast, dear. Nothing special." Then, my mother's gaze flickered towards my plate. I'd managed to scrape together a few meager portions, trying to make them look more substantial than they were. "Are you not hungry, darling?" she asked, her tone laced with a subtle, accusatory edge. It was then that Mark piped up, his voice a little too loud, a little too eager. "She's on a diet, Mum. You know how she is." The room went still. My fork clattered against my plate. The statement wasn't true, not really. I wasn't on a diet, I was being starved. The deliberate rationing, the subtle discouragement from eating, the constant implication that my presence was an imposition, it was all a calculated performance. My mother, ever the master manipulator, seized the opportunity. "Oh, is that right?" she said, turning her saccharine gaze back to me. "Well, I wouldn't want you to feel deprived. But you know, darling, it's important to have a balanced meal, especially on a special occasion." She gestured towards the platter of chicken. "There's plenty for everyone. Sarah, dear, you have some more. Don't be shy." Sarah, bless her oblivious heart, smiled and reached for another piece. Mark, oblivious to the simmering storm behind my calm exterior, dug into his own plate. I watched them, my jaw tight, the feeling of betrayal a physical ache in my chest. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the deliberate exclusion, the public humiliation, the calculated cruelty dressed up as concern. My mother, in her insatiable need to control, had orchestrated a scenario where I was made to feel like an inconvenience, a burden even on Christmas Day. The word starved us echoed in my mind, not literally in the sense of no food at all, but in the emotional and psychological starvation, the deliberate denial of warmth, inclusion, and basic care. My gaze met my mother's. She offered a small, tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. It was a smile of triumph, of a battle won. The message was clear: I was to be seen and not heard, to be present but not acknowledged, to be a ghost at my own family's table. I pushed my plate away, the meager portions now looking like a cruel joke. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with all the unspoken resentments and years of silent endurance. Sarah, sensing the shift, offered a hesitant smile. "Everything okay?" she asked, her gaze flitting between my mother and me. My mother, ever the actress, quickly recovered. "Of course, dear. Just a little family moment." She patted my hand dismissively, her touch as cold as the winter air outside. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom, the familiar floral wallpaper mocking me with its cheerful design. The gnawing emptiness in my stomach was a physical manifestation of the emotional void that had been created. I replayed the scene, dissecting every glance, every word, every subtle manipulation. The desire for retribution, for a taste of the quiet justice I knew I deserved, began to simmer. It wouldn't be loud, or dramatic. It would be precise, calculated, and deeply satisfying. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. The holidays were over, and the usual post-Christmas lull had settled in. My mother, having successfully navigated her Christmas performance, had retreated to her usual routine of running the household with an iron fist. Mark and Sarah were still visiting, blissfully unaware that the domestic peace was about to be shattered, not by an explosion of anger, but by a quiet, meticulous dismantling of her carefully constructed world. My mother had always been obsessed with appearances. Her social standing, her reputation within our small community, her control over every aspect of her family's lives, these were her pillars. And like any good architect, she had built her foundation on carefully curated narratives, often at the expense of truth. The inheritance, the house, the very notion of family security, these were all tools she wielded to maintain her power. For weeks, I had been quietly compiling documents. Not just financial statements, but correspondence, receipts, emails, anything that painted a picture of her financial dealings, particularly those related to the sale of my father's business. There were clauses in the initial agreements, tucked away in dusty folders, that she had likely forgotten about, or perhaps assumed I would never find, or even understand. She had always underestimated my intelligence, dismissing my concerns as childish anxieties. I found the original contract for the sale of my father's manufacturing company. It was a complex document, drafted years ago, full of legalese and fine print. My mother had handled the negotiations, eager to liquidate assets after my father's death. She'd assured me it was a straightforward sale, that the buyer was reputable, and that the money would be split equitably. She hadn't bothered to explain the it clauses, the performance-based buyouts, or the clauses that stipulated additional payments if the company's profit margins exceeded a certain threshold within 5 years of the sale. The buyer, a shrewd businessman named Mr. Henderson, had always been a man of his word. He'd honored the contract meticulously, and the company, under his leadership, had thrived. I'd kept in touch with him, a discreet professional correspondence, purely out of a sense of obligation to my father's legacy. He'd been surprised by my initial inquiries, but also, understanding. He'd seen the shrewdness in my mother's negotiation, but also the loopholes she'd overlooked, or perhaps, the ones she'd intentionally left for a future payout she'd never anticipated needing. The opportunity presented itself during a quiet afternoon. Mark and Sarah had gone out for a walk, leaving my mother to her afternoon nap. The house was silent, filled with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a constant reminder of time marching on, indifferent to our petty dramas. I found my mother in her study, surrounded by paperwork, the faint scent of expensive perfume clinging to the air. I walked in, a single manila folder in my hand. She looked up, her brow furrowed, annoyance flickering in her eyes. "What is it now?" she asked, her tone already dismissive. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead or explain. I simply placed the folder on the desk, nudging aside a stack of unsolicited charity appeals. "It's about the sale of Dad's company," I said, my voice low and steady. She waved a dismissive hand. "That was years ago, darling. All settled." "Not quite," I replied, my gaze level. "There are some performance bonuses tied to the sale. According to this," I tapped the folder, "Mr. Henderson is due to release the final tranche of payments next month. The company's profits have exceeded the agreed-upon benchmarks for the past 3 consecutive years." Her eyes narrowed. She picked up the folder, her manicured nails clicking against the cardstock. As she flipped through the pages, her expression shifted. The annoyance morphed into a flicker of confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror. Her face, usually a mask of serene control, began to crumble. The carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the sudden pallor of her skin, the widening of her eyes. This isn't possible," she stammered, her voice losing its usual authoritative edge. "I handled all of that. It was a clean break." "The contract says otherwise," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "My father's name is on this contract, and so is yours. But it was written with the assumption of a fair distribution. When Mr. Henderson realized you'd overlooked these clauses, he offered me the opportunity to ensure they were honored. He said he owed it to your husband's legacy to see the agreement fulfilled completely." The color drained from her face. The sheer audacity of the situation, the meticulous planning, the fact that I had the documents, the understanding of the legalities, and the backing of the buyer, it was all too much. She'd always seen me as the meek daughter, easily managed, easily dismissed. She'd never imagined I would possess the knowledge, the patience, or the cold resolve to unpick her carefully woven web of deceit. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate plea, a silent demand for me to back down, to pretend this never happened. But the years of silent endurance, of swallowed pride, of carefully suppressed anger, had built a dam. And now, it was breaking. "The money from those bonuses," I continued, my voice a calm, measured tide, "is to be split equally between myself and Mark. It amounts to a considerable sum, enough to significantly impact both of our financial futures. And to ensure there are no misunderstandings, I've already coordinated with Mr. Henderson's legal team regarding the transfer. They will be in touch with you next week." The smugness, the entitlement, the manipulative facade, it all evaporated. She was exposed, her carefully constructed world of control and perceived superiority crumbling around her. her face contorted with a mixture of rage and despair. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was speechless, her power stripped away with a few well-placed words and a meticulously prepared document. The following days were a whirlwind. My mother's frantic texts began almost immediately. First, to me, then to Mark, then to a select few of her cronies in our social circle. Her messages were a torrent of accusations, a desperate attempt to portray me as the villain, the ungrateful daughter seeking to extort her. She even tried to enlist Sarah, painting a picture of a family crisis caused by my selfish actions. But Sarah, despite her initial bewilderment, had seen the look on my mother's face, had heard the tremor in her voice. She'd also seen my calm, measured demeanor, my unwavering conviction. When my mother tried to pin her narrative, Sarah listened politely, but her own quiet observations had painted a different picture. Mark, bless his heart, was initially confused. He'd always seen his mother as infallible, her actions beyond question. But when I calmly presented him with the facts, with the documentation, and explained the years of subtle manipulation, he began to see. He was hurt, of course, by his mother's deceit, but also, strangely, relieved. The burden of his mother's favor had always weighed on him, the unspoken expectation of loyalty. Now, he had a reason to step back, to reevaluate. He called me, his voice a mixture of shock and a quiet, dawning understanding. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I never realized. My mother's flying monkeys, those loyal subjects who always seemed to rally to her defense, were met with a polite, but firm, wall of silence. I didn't engage in their gossip or defend myself against their thinly veiled accusations. Their opinions no longer held any sway. They were relics of a past I was steadily leaving behind. The social fallout was swift and silent. My mother, who had always prided herself on her community standing, found herself ostracized by those who were privy to the truth. The whispers, the averted gazes, the sudden lack of invitations to the exclusive garden parties she so cherished, these were the consequences of her actions, delivered not by me, but by the natural order of things. She had wielded her power with a careless hand, and now, the pendulum had swung back. She tried to fight, to rally her forces, but her credibility was gone. The carefully constructed image of the benevolent matriarch had been shattered, revealing the calculating manipulator beneath. Her anger turned to bitterness, her frustration to a quiet, simmering resentment. She was no longer the queen of her domain, she was a pariah. The final transfer of funds occurred without a hitch. The quiet click of the keyboard, the confirmation email, the sight of my bank account balance, it was a tangible representation of a debt repaid, a wrong righted. There was no grand celebration, no triumphant pronouncements. Just a quiet, internal sense of resolution. The emptiness in my stomach had finally subsided, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. My mother had starved us of Christmas cheer, of genuine affection, of fair treatment. But in her hunger for control, she had overlooked the quiet strength that can bloom in the shadows. And in the end, her own insatiable greed had been her undoing. The silence that followed was not one of regret, but of a deep, profound calm. The game was over, and the quiet justice had been served.